Initiative, represented by Viviana Varin, the Senior Communications Associate who has done a great job from Paris organizing this press conference. And we're honored to be joined by a very distinguished panel of speakers. Some are here in the press club and others are online. And I'll be pleased to introduce them to you in turn. But first, I'd like to start with a quote from a well-known personality. If governments are serious about the climate crisis, there can be no new investments in oil, gas, and coal from now, from this year. That wasn't Greta Thunberg, that was Fatih Birol, the executive director of the International Energy Agency. And he didn't say it this year in 2023, he said it 2 years ago in 2021. So it seems that after every wake-up call, whether it's from the IEA or the IPCC, world leaders simply hit the snooze button and go back to sleep. Will it be different this time? We hope our persistence will finally pay off because the IPCC synthesis report published this week could not be clearer. The report declares with high confidence, and I quote, estimates of future CO2 emissions from existing fossil fuel infrastructures without additional abatement already exceed the remaining carbon budget for limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. Projected cumulative future CO2 emissions over the lifetime of existing and planned fossil fuel infrastructure, if historical operating patterns are maintained and without additional abatement, are approximately equal to the remaining carbon budget for limiting warming to 2 degrees with a likelihood of 83%. And we know from the IPCC what a disaster 2 degrees of temperature rise would be. So it was additional abatement, in other words, carbon capture, the solution. Well, the IPCC tells us that, and I quote, implementation of carbon capture and storage, CCS, currently faces technological, economic, institutional, ecological, environmental, and socio-cultural barriers. So it's not yet the silver bullet that we're hoping for. The IPCC also states effective climate action is enabled by political commitment, well-aligned multi-level governance, institutional frameworks, laws, policies, and strategies, and enhanced access to finance and technology. And that is what we expect and demand from the 27 heads of state and government who will be meeting at the European Council just up the street tomorrow, Thursday. We expect political commitment, laws, and policies underpinned by a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. To quote Alex Rafalowicz, the executive director of the treaty, the summary for policymakers is simple. Stop now fossil fuel projects, phase down existing polluting projects, put renewable energy access into hyperdrive. So tomorrow evening, we will hold a rally as close to the council building as we're allowed to be, making a lot of noise to get that message across to the EU leaders. Now, let's hear from our panel. Our first speaker, who is here with us online, is Harjit Singh, the Strategic Advisor of Global Partnerships to the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. He is a global expert on the issues of climate impacts, migration, and adaptation, and has been supporting countries across the world on tackling climate change. He is also head of global political strategy at Climate Action Network International. And Harjit, having seen and heard you speak to the crowds at COP27, I expect that you won't be pulling your punches, so please go ahead.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you very much for having me. And this is such an important conversation today, immediately after the IPCC has issued such a stark warning that we are not on track and we only have a narrow window of opportunity to avert the crisis and also help people who are facing climate impacts. Last week, some of us were there from civil society, and we have seen some very intense discussions. And we've also seen how the report brings out some facts building on the work that happened over the last few years. It is such an authoritative report. Not only it is overarching in its analysis, but it also provides details and what I call is a blueprint that is now available to us as a global society, and particularly for policymakers. It connects the dots. It builds on those 6 reports, and I would say it also closes the loop in so many ways, because the first report, as you all remember, was in 2018, going deep into analyzing the impacts that 1.5 degree warming will cause in comparison to 2 degrees. And look at what we are witnessing at 1.1 degree of global average temperature rise, where we see disasters everywhere. And even at 1.5 degree, we are going to see so much of devastation. And every fraction of warming matters. So for us and for the global communities, and particularly for vulnerable countries, 1.5 is a survival target. It should now become a linchpin for all our actions and how we are going to measure progress to avert the crisis, and also make sure that people get enough support to deal with climate impact. So we have a very narrow window to avert the crisis, and we cannot allow that overshoot to happen beyond 1.5 degrees. And as Larry, you very clearly mentioned, we can't just depend on unproven technologies. We can't talk about those long-term targets and imagine that there'll be some miraculous technology that's going to save the world. That's not going to happen. And there are many other things that this report highlights. We all know the kind of impacts we are facing. Even at a low emission pathway, some of the impacts are already irreversible, such as sea level rise, melting of glaciers. We are seeing mass extinction of species, which means that we have already reached a point where we are going to be facing such impacts. We cannot just allow the same model of development to happen. And that's why this report calls for deep, rapid, and sustained emission reductions. Throughout the report, this language is there, and I'm going to repeat it: deep, rapid, and sustained emission reductions. And these reductions cannot happen unless we move away from our addiction to fossil fuels. We have been hearing about the target of halving our emissions by 2030. Now we also have a pathway. There are very specific targets for 2035, 2040, 60 and 70% respectively, before we become carbon neutral by 2050. And we also heard UN Secretary General urging rich countries to become carbon neutral by 2040. Now, what does that mean? When the science sets a target for the whole world, for 2050, rich countries who are responsible for the crisis in large part, have most resources, and have an obligation to act fast. They need to do it much before. They cannot talk about 2050, and they need to be doing it now. And that's why when this report says that we should be peaking now, and by 2025, we should start declining, which means rich countries have to make a huge contribution in leading that pathway. We look at the summary report, the working group 3 report that came out last year, this time, also mentioned that we just cannot afford to have continuous exploration and expansion. And as you very rightly said, it's not just IPCC now, even IEA is saying that we cannot go for any expansion. So what we need to do, we need to keep fossil fuels in the ground. We have to transform our economies, and what we need is a global framework. And this is where we talk about treaty. I'm sure other panelists are going to be referring to that. But the IPCC report also talks about just transition. It even mentions that how solutions are available. We don't have to wait for a new miraculous solution. Solar, wind, they have become far more cheaper. And we also have to talk about and move towards balanced diets, which means more plant-based diets and protection of ecosystems. So when we have all these solutions, why are we not bending the curve? Which means we need that political will. On the other hand, we see more investments going to fossil fuels. Again, IPCC report clearly mentions that more money should go to solutions and not fossil fuel industry. It also talks about removing subsidies from what's going to fossil fuels. IMF said that the subsidies that's going to fossil fuel industry is to the tune of $11 million per minute. $11 million per minute. So something that is causing the crisis is getting more resources. And we also know the kind of unimaginable profits fossil fuel industry has made, from all over the world, and has caused not only climate crisis, but also health crisis and global energy crisis. So on one hand, we see fossil fuel industry continues to increase its investments, which we just cannot allow. Science makes it very clear. And on the other hand, we are facing consequences. So we need to now follow what this report says. The message to policymakers is absolutely clear. We need that political will. There is a huge momentum, ground up, that's coming from young people, from Nobel laureates, from civil society organizations, and from many countries. As you know, last week we got a group of 6 countries in the Pacific urging to have now a fossil fuel treaty. I'm sure we'll hear more about it. So we need that political will to reach a level where the world comes together and now talks about the solution. And we can do it. That's what this report says, and keeps the hope alive of staying below 1.5. Let me stop here for now.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Harjeet. So if I had to summarize our position on climate change and fossil fuels in 4 words, of course, they would be: listen to the science. Julia Steinberger is one of the 3,000 scientists and academics who endorsed the call for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty in 2020. She is a climate scientist who researches and teaches ecological economics and industrial ecology. She is professor of societal challenges of climate change at the University of Lausanne. And of particular interest to us today, she is lead author for the IPCC's 6th assessment report with Working Group 3, which focuses on climate change mitigation. So, Professor Steinberger, we're listening.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the invitation. You already quoted the IPCC report, so I will not repeat that, but I basically just want to make clear that existing fossil fuel infrastructure blows past the 1.5 degree target, and planned fossil fuel infrastructure, planned projects will go even much further than that. So the existing fossil fuel infrastructure corresponds, according to the IPCC report, to about 660 gigatons of carbon to be emitted, when the limit for 1.5 would be around 500. And planned carbon bombs, planned carbon emissions from fossil fuel infrastructure that is yet to be implemented would double that, according to research that was published last May, which is actually after the cutoff date for what the IPCC takes into account. So we know, and that goes well past 2 degrees. And one of the things that we need to understand is that these are not just numbers that are slightly boring. This means these numbers condemn to death or displacement or disease and misery millions of people, entire countries and regions that will be either underwater because of ocean level rise, or subjected to deadly heat, drought, floods, and storms that we're already starting to see at 1.1 degrees. So this reality of what the fossil fuel industry is currently doing and has planned in the pipeline is completely incompatible with future human prosperity. This is why Antonio Guterres on Monday, when he was introducing the IPCC's report, called for a rapid phase down of every single type of fossil fuel, oil, coal, and gas, echoing obviously what Fatih Birol, the head of the International Energy, has been saying already for some years. Another point that I want to insist upon as a scientist is that the fossil fuel industry itself can't be trusted. And we know that in a very simple way. That's because they still exist, despite their extremely accurate climate projections. So we know from a paper that was published by Jeffrey Supra, Naomi Oreskes, and Stefan Ramsdorff in January 2023 in Science magazine that Exxon knew already since 50 years that their emissions from their product caused climate change. Their predictions were extremely accurate, in fact, rivaled or outdid, in some cases, the projections from public university-funded scientists that were usually slightly later to the game. And so we know that the fossil fuel industry was highly aware of what their products do and are doing to our societies and our planet. Instead of investing in alternatives for the past 50 years, they have been investing in disinformation, corruption, outright harassment of climate scientists, as we know from, for instance, the ClimateGate fabricated scandal. And they've now moved into climate delay, so delaying action in any way they can. And I would argue that their use of offsets and their use of language around carbon capture, trying to project the impression that one can still emit and then just remove the carbon from the atmosphere is part of those delay tactics. And they're consolidating their capture of our governments and consolidating their subsidies, which are still extremely high. We still pay through our governments for this fossil fuel industry to stay alive, despite the fact that it is economically less competitive than renewable energy on average around the world now. So all of these things make me say, I think with very strong case, that this industry cannot be trusted as a partner in the transition, which is what a lot of people would like to believe or like to pretend that they believe. The fossil fuel industry has been touring the world, convincing very gullible politicians that they are necessary for well-being and development, and that they can remove their emissions through offsets and carbon capture. Offsets and carbon capture, as we have heard, are not to be trusted. There has been research into them. They are either destructive to ecosystems in a lot of cases, or simply don't materialize or go up in smoke. Or in terms of carbon capture, despite research and investment, it turns out this is just very hard to do and is not a safe technology to plan a stable planet upon. It is just not to be relied upon. So on the well-being and development side, we actually know that we can secure well-being and development at much lower levels of energy use than are currently consumed if we invest differently. And so we know we have alternatives. We know we don't need fossil fuels for well-being and development, and we know that we cannot trust them as partners in this transition. So I would say that this causes me to conclude that the only way that we can sensibly prevent climate cataclysm from worsening far into the future and costing lives and life chances for everybody on the planet far into the future is to move our politicians and governments to openly confront this industry by endorsing and passing the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julia, for that indictment of the fossil fuel industry. And maybe someday Exxon New will be engraved on its tombstone. Now, as if the climate crisis weren't bad enough, the war in Ukraine has precipitated an unprecedented energy and cost of living crisis in Europe and worldwide. In the absence of Russian oil and gas, African countries in particular are paying the price of Europe's desperate search for alternative sources. Svitlana Romanko, here in the room with us, is founder and director of the Ukrainian organization Razom We Stand, which grew out of the successful Stand with Ukraine campaign to end the global fossil fuel addiction that feeds Putin's war machine. She's been an environmental lawyer for over 20 years and a high-impact climate justice campaigner for a decade. Svitlana is also a champion for the Fossil Fuel Treaty campaign. Svitlana, please share with us your thoughts about climate and peace.
Yes, good morning. I don't know if the microphone is working, but still, it does not really matter. You can hear me well. Yes, being here in general seems a bit surreal when I getting back just to my country and what is happening right now in the largest country in Europe, attacked by Russians, but also by Russian fossil fuels. 1 year ago, roughly 1 year ago, we started global campaign which demanded the global and national governments, and specifically the EU, and global fossil fuel addictions that feeds Putin's war machine. And a year has passed. We had 40% of our energy infrastructure destroyed in Ukraine by Russian missiles and all types of weapons. And we had human losses, huge human losses, and we have almost 90,000 of war crimes, just those whom we know being documented as of now. And just recently, we've saw the warrant for Putin, for the head of the terrorist state, who is now wanted by International Criminal Court. But what's happening in the EU, back to Brussels, the capital of the EU Parliament, EU Council, and also EU Commission? Yes, European Union has significantly decreased the share in consumption of fossil gas. Yes, they try to take all steps towards the clean energy transition, and they increased their solar and wind capacity significantly by 40% over the last year. But do we see enough of political action from European Union? It has been taken through all 10 EU summits that we have seen going through the past year, and all ministers of energy discussing the global energy crisis and global energy insecurity that also fits the war in my country and a lot of conflicts all over the world. We must remember that, yes, the war is horrific, and it's just really poignant to my heart and to many of my compatriots who are now on the front line. But at the same time, it may lead us to what scientists told us to do for many years, including the recent IPCC report. We must stop burning oil, gas, and coal immediately, and we must invest all possible financial sources, investments, all monies that European Union has enough to subsidize still fossil fuel industry and open the new developments of gas in some other countries abroad. And if you come back to in April last year, where we demanded for a full embargo on Russian oil and gas and coal, yes, we've got embargo on coal, we've got embargo on oil partial, which is been breaking because the EU sanctions have a loopholes into them, and no one is so far able to express enough political willpower to close these loopholes and finally end the financial flows to Putin's war machine. And but what the EU can do more in regard to being politically bold in taking steps towards true energy security and true energy stability? Because what we have now, it's absolutely not. US is going to open a new gas fields, which will release into the atmosphere billions of cubic meters of CO2. But we already have them enough. We have them more than enough. And we have to stop the fossil fuel industry profiteering on the war crisis and the crisis in my country, but also on the energy poverty in many countries, cost of living crisis, and those crises that have led us to this point where we are. And I also wanted to speak a bit about the fake or false energy security narrative, which has been spread widely by fossil fuel industry, who is over-profited last year. If they only sent 3% of their annual profits, which will make 100 billion of US dollars equivalent to cut methane emissions, it would cut 75% of methane emissions, which could significantly decrease the emissions into the atmosphere and tackle climate crisis, but they don't. And state subsidies for fossil fuel industry must end immediately. And especially what I wanted to say, that governments must stop all new fossil fuel infrastructure projects that are underway in Scotland, in the US, everywhere we can see it. And the first thing the German government did when the EU expressed their concerns about driving their economy, they just went to travel to African countries and tried to get Senegal, tried to get Egypt gas. And but when there is a moment to speak about deployment of renewables, because only renewable energy is the energy of peace and security, and it now becomes cheaper and cheaper. And Fatih Birol, whom you mentioned, he just sent recently two important things which I wanted to reiterate and recall right now for the press conference. First, that yes, indeed, the war has caused immense, the deepest crisis, energy crisis in history, but it also provides us with immense opportunity to end fossil fuel addiction and to phase out fossil fuels, which treaty demands for it. And I will tell about this just in 1 second. And the second important, why I'm here as a Ukrainian climate activist and a campaigner who endorsed the treaty as well, Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, in April last year, where we had such a significant losses in Bucha, Mariupol, Irpin, and all the cities, and we just faced the first atrocities of Russian war crimes. We endorsed the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty with Ukrainian civil society, and we sent to our governments a demand to endorse the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty because it's a life or death issue. And I wanted to show you one poster, which I'm going to attend tomorrow. I won't miss this opportunity, which says the fossil fuels are weapons of mass destruction, and we must stop their use. We must stop their use immediately. And that's why we are calling to European governments right now, to the ministers of energy sitting in the very far away, it's very close, next building, but it's very far away from the ordinary people as we are. Those political leaders, we are calling on them to stop proliferation of weapons of mass destruction that fossil fuels are. And the second step should be keeping our temperature in line with 1.5 degrees Celsius, and also facilitating and providing all financial support for just transition for every worker, every community, and every country. So we hope that European Union will go ahead, will prove their status of global leader, which we don't want European Union to lose. We just want them to prove this status quite bold, in a bold and robust way. And we demand of them to endorse and continue what European Parliament started doing, and endorse the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty as a bold mechanism for keeping this world safe and just, and not falling into climate catastrophe. And this will also end the war in my country, I believe, if European Union will impose the full sanctions and won't be looking for expanding gas infrastructure to keep business as usual in many places of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Svetlana. And certainly it would be the only silver lining in this disastrous war if it could accelerate the phase out of fossil fuels. Now, in a section called Cities, Settlements, and Infrastructure, the IPCC report tells us that urban systems are critical for achieving deep emissions reductions and advancing climate resilient development. So I'm very pleased to introduce Barbara Tracht, who I believe has one of the most challenging jobs in the Brussels regional government as the Secretary of State for Economic Transition and Scientific Research. The Brussels region is one of 77 cities worldwide that have signed the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, and Barbara is leading the city's economic transition towards climate neutrality. Secretary Tracht, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this invitation, and thank you a lot for your testimony. It makes very clear, you made very clear that climate issue goes well beyond, or the energy issue goes well beyond climate issue. It's also a question of democracy, freedom, and peace. So at the level of Brussels region, it's only a city. We are actively engaged in this transition toward carbon-free society that respects its environment. The Parliament already adopted in 2021 climate neutrality law. And this law also marked an acceleration in the phasing out of fossil fuels. Last December, as you said, we also joined the global call for a non-proliferation, for a treaty on the non-proliferation of fossil fuels. And we joined it because we are convinced that alternatives exist and that, of course, fossil fuels are detrimental to climate solutions. So we are not only talking about this call, but we also follow this call with concrete actions. Indeed, we have a new air, climate, energy plan, like Wallonia, and we are further accelerating the phasing out from fossil fuels with very concrete measures, like measures on car engines, on building renovation, and on reducing the energy consumption of housing. We are also, it's very important, strengthening energy communities to promote renewable energy and to involve the citizens of our city. And these measures are both ambitious and realistic. We are also part of the European program, the Horizon Europe mission for climate neutral cities. And with this program, we are experimenting innovative solutions to accelerate and to achieve climate neutrality already in 2030. We are going to have a climate city contract to list all the action by 2030. And with this label, we will attract more private investment and have access to more European funding. We will also need, I think it's really important, vast network of support for this climate city contract to ensure that it is well known and well spread among the citizens and support in the society and also in the economy of Brussels. We hope we will be able to count on the support of universities to have young people sign it. And we also want to work with companies that want to engage in this process. We are also very convinced that the phasing out fossil fuels represents also innovation and economic opportunities. And actually, we are convinced, but we also see it. And that's the reason why we adopted, the government adopted our economic strategy, our new economic strategy of transition. We call it shifting economy. And it's more than 200 measures aimed at redirecting the economic tools of Brussels to accelerate the transition. It states that by 2030, all the regional subsidies for the economy will be reserved only for socially and environmentally exemplary business models. It's also a concrete policy to accelerate the transition. So with these examples, I wanted to show you that the call for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty is relevant, of course, it's necessary, but it's also realistic. And of course, as everybody said here today, the climate emergency requires us to act and to act quickly. So I hope this movement will be joined by many supporters, other cities, of course, but not only cities, also by all countries and industrialized country, very, very heavy industrialized country. And you can count on us, on the Brussels Capital Region, to lead this fight. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for your leadership here in the capital of Europe. On the 11th of October, 2022, the European Parliament passed a resolution on the UN Climate Change Conference in Sharm el-Sheikh, COP27, in which it, I quote, reminds the Commission and the member states of their obligations to set a deadline for the phasing out of fossil fuel subsidies consistent with the ambition of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, as well as to develop a binding union framework to monitor and report on member states' progress towards phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. Calls on the Commission in all member states to implement concrete policies, timelines, and measures to phase out all direct and indirect fossil fuel subsidies as soon as possible, and by 2025 at the very latest. Encourages other parties to undertake similar measures and to work on developing a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. So today we have with us online a member of the European Parliament who not only voted for this resolution, but is also a signatory of the parliamentarian call for a fossil-free future signed by over 500 parliamentarians. Manon Aubry, a French MEP, representing La France Insoumise and president of the Left Group. Manon, the Zoom floor is yours.
Thanks.
Please, if you could keep it to 5 minutes because we are running a bit late and we want to allow enough
I'll check the time
for questions. Thank you.
No worries. I'll check the time. First, thanks everyone for the invitation. It's obviously a pleasure to be with you, although it's only on Zoom. I'll, as a start, I'm not going to be long because it's so great to talk after such a range of experts and activists, and I think Julia has laid down the grounds of why this is very much needed, why the European Parliament and the EU Commission needs to act very quickly. when I see, the last IPCC reports and the need to reduce emission by sharply giving up fossil fuels. And fossil fuel in the European Union has always been something like on the side. There's the climate ambition, but it's fine in a way to keep on with the fossil fuel. This is the reason why with a few other members of the European Parliament, we've been really pushing in every climate discussion the issue of phasing out fossil fuel. It's obviously not been easy, but we know that fossil fuels are responsible for more than 86% of the CO2 emission in the last decade. This is obviously very much needed. So you've mentioned the resolution that was adopted ahead of the last COP in October. It endorsed a very clear call for fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. It's the very first time that our parliament takes such a clear position on this. And it's also grounded, I think, the international support to the initiative. But unfortunately, up till now, both the EU Commission and the Council have not done anything with it yet. On the contrary, there's a very big issue of consistency at EU level because at the same time, we're calling for phasing out of fossil fuel, but on the other hand, there's, for example, the taxonomy in which we give, in a way, subsidies to gas industry. The way gas is treated as well in the EU also in relation to the current war in Ukraine is very problematic because they often differentiate coal and gas, although both should be treated as fossil and polluting industries. The amendments from our group also allowed Parliament support of the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance. And now it's time for the Commission and the Council to respect the EP position. The EU has several leverages, but clearly the main leverages will be also the next COP. The EU now tends to consider itself as a real diplomatic entity, so we need the EU to come in the next COP with strong wording on fossil fuel non-proliferation to ensure that it ends up in the final COP decision. Which brings me to the issue that is very much connected. That is obviously the conflict of interest that is very prominent in the COP. We know that polluting interests are playing a role. They have a major influence at the decision-making table. And if we want to be consistent as well, I think as the European Parliament, we should push to ensure that we basically kick them out of the table. We all know that the Paris Agreement has no reference or mention of fossil fuel. COP 27 and 28 only mention coal. And it's similar at COP level that what we're seeing at EU level, that difference that I was mentioning between coal and gas, that's why we need to align both of them, and not talking also about the need to include oil. We cannot expect for sure at global level major advances until the EU understands that everything has to change. And quickly, and there's several other tools that are also connected at EU level. I'll just conclude on that, mentioning them. One is REPOR EU, that is the EU directive that includes diversifying, sorry for my English, energy supply by shifting away from Russian gas. But the problem is that we've been shifting away from Russian gas up till, for example, Qatari gas. I've been involved myself also in denouncing some of the conflict of interest, and I've witnessing myself some of the blackmailing that Qatar has been doing on gas when we've been negotiating a resolution on denouncing human rights violations in Qatar connected to the World Cup. So in theory, nothing to do with gas, but all of a sudden the issue of supplying gas went into the discussion. So it shows that they're all there's still a lot of influence and pressure on the EU, and we're shifting from one dependency to another, and we really need to build our own resilience. The same goes for the energy efficiency. That's also a key to curb the use of fossil fuel, and that means also major energy renovation plans to avoid energy losses. The last one that will be relevant also at EU level will be the ambient air quality directive, where we'll push as well for ambitious progress. I'll end there just to say that I can see a shift in some of the discourse at the EU level that is very much welcome, and this is the result of the pressure of external stakeholders, of the civil society, of the Non-Proliferation coalition, and the fossil fuel, in particular, Non-Proliferation treaty. But we're still missing the action. We're still missing the consistency in all EU policies to ensure this is cross-cutting. And this is the next step in which, with some of my colleagues, I wish all of the parliament, but at least some of my colleagues will push both the Commission and the Council to make sure that this is aligned. And I'll end there with my more or less 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Manon, for your efforts at the European Parliament. And now, finally, last but certainly not least, a good friend of Rise for Climate, Olivier de Scutter, who has been very generous with his time on many occasions, but today he does have to leave very soon. So just a note to journalists, if you have questions for him, then we'll take those questions first so that he can leave on time. Olivier is a Belgian legal scholar specializing in economic and social rights. He's a professor of international law at UC Louvain, and he is the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. Olivier is also a champion of the Fossil Fuel Treaty campaign. So Olivier, please share with us your insights.
Thank you very much, Larry, and a very warm welcome to all at this press conference. There is today a very strong momentum behind the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty with 6 Pacific countries that have formally decided to launch an alliance in support of this initiative. And the momentum should be maintained and strengthened in the next few weeks. This is important for essentially 3 reasons. The first is we have done a fair bit to promote renewable energies from wind, from solar power, from hydroelectricity, dams. But that has only added to the energy mix, has not led to a decrease of the reliance on fossil energies, coal, oil, or gas, responsible for 86% of the total greenhouse gas emissions, as we heard. And the synthesis report of the IPCC on its 6th assessment cycle, again, has warned us about the urgency of doing so in order to mitigate climate change, to avoid catastrophic outcomes. So the first reason why we need this treaty urgently is because what we have been doing so far to promote renewable energies will not suffice. We need not simply innovation, we need exnovation. We need to move away from our addiction to fossil fuels. The fossil fuels, however, remain in place because of 3 lock-ins. Firstly, because infrastructures are linked to a fossil fuel-dependent economic model. For example, you have 282 million cars circulating in the US, fueled with gasoline and diesel. And of course, they rely on a very large network of gas stations on which many people depend. So it's a whole system that has to change, requiring that governments take seriously their responsibilities to make this happen. Moreover, the economic interests of fossil fuel producers are linked to the interests of the users of cheap energy, such as aluminum producers in particular. Subsidies to fossil fuel energy have reached an all-time high in 2022, almost doubling in comparison to the figures of 2021. In 2021, 532 billion US dollars went into subsidizing fossil fuels. Today, in 2022, the figure was around $1 trillion globally. And the top countries are Russia, Iran, and China, followed by India, which is number 4 on this list. The third lock-in is the very strong lobbying efforts by some states and by economic actors to maintain the status quo. As we heard from Julia Steinberger, these major economic actors, the fossil fuel industry, are using lies, are using intimidation of scientists, as quite clearly exposed in the book of Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway, Merchants of Doubt, showing how today fossil fuel producers resort to the same techniques that were used by the tobacco industry in the 1980s. And this is why we need, in the future, to have a very strong prohibition of those industries influencing public policies in the field of energy, like we have in the World Health Organization's Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, one article, Article 5, Paragraph 3, that imposes on states to ensure that public policies in for the phasing out of tobacco should not be influenced by the tobacco industry. The latest game played by the fossil fuel industry is what has now been called green shifting. In other terms, shifting responsibilities on the shoulders of the end consumer. But as we all know, demand for fossil fuel will continue as long as supply continues and is heavily subsidized, as I've mentioned. The third reason why we need to endorse this treaty and why we need more states to engage in this process, beyond the need to realize this ex-novation and to break these lock-ins, is very simply, as expressed by Bill McKibben, the founder of the NGO 350.org, we'll be running out of the planet before we run out of fossil energy. We simply cannot afford to exploit all the gas and oil from the fields that have already been discovered, let alone explore new fields or resort to new techniques such as fracking or the exploitation of tar sands, as is done in the Canadian province of Alberta. Burning all the world's fossil fuel reserves would result in 7 times more emissions than would be compatible with the 1.5 degree scenario that states have committed to in the Paris Agreement in 2005. Let me close by saying that the energy transition we need is not only necessary, it is also an opportunity. In the report I presented to the UN General Assembly in October 2020, I highlight how the shift to renewable sources of energy can be more job intensive, creating jobs in the green economy, can result in less air pollution, particularly in cities, from cleaner cars and cleaner types of industrial production, and can be protecting states from having to depend on geopolitically sensitive regions. The dependency on fossil fuels means today dependency on a small range of countries that are unstable or under authoritarian leadership, such as Russia or the Gulf states. And so we need this treaty. We need to move faster towards building this momentum behind the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, and we need to get rid of this addiction to fossil fuels. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Olivier. And clearly fossil fuels are just as addictive as nicotine, but thank you also for pointing out the positive aspects of the energy transition. So that concludes our speeches from the panel, and now we'd like to hear from journalists who would like to ask questions. And as I said, Olivier really needs to leave in just a couple of minutes, so if you have any questions for him, please go ahead. Oh, and okay, and then so Barbara has to leave as well. No questions. Everything was so clear. Please.
possibility of the what do you think about the possibility of juridical actions against companies, fuel fossil companies? Because I have seen that there are more and more that kind of actions, and I want to know what are the possibilities. And that's one point. And the other question is, European Union is signing a lot of free exchange treaty, and we know that there is the ISDS problem about these treaties, so that the companies can attack a state in front of a commercial private jurisdiction, or arbitrage. I don't know how we call that in English, but it's a private tribunal, and in that case, most of the time, the economical point of view is more important than the defense of the human rights and the environmental rights. So that's my question: how is it possible to stop the impunity of the fossil fuels company in such a juridical background or context?
So let me answer very briefly these two questions. So firstly, there is indeed a wave of litigation of suits against oil companies. And one major example is the decision adopted by Dutch courts in June 2021 against Royal Dutch Shell, forcing Royal Dutch Shell to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions for which it is responsible itself and its suppliers. We also have a case against Total Energy in France based on the same idea that oil companies must phase out gradually their exploitation of oil reserves and must comply with the Paris Agreement. This is bound to continue. It's important to realize that a small handful of companies, in fact, are responsible for a major part of the problem of greenhouse gas emissions. One count by Richard Head about 9 years ago was that the 90 most important companies in the fields of oil, gas, and cement were responsible for about 2/3 of total greenhouse gas emissions since the Industrial Revolution. So these are the carbon majors that should indeed be held accountable, including before courts, because this leads to the violation of human rights of large populations. And I very much welcome the use of courts as governments are failing our expectations. On your second question, it is true that many investment treaties protect investors from regulatory action by states in the field or in the area of fossil fuels production. It is the Energy Charter Treaty of 1994 that has been a major problem over the past 30 years. This treaty was designed at the time when the Soviet Union was breaking down to protect the investments of oil and gas companies in geopolitically volatile regions. But today, that treaty has become an obstacle for governments to make a shift to renewable sources of energy. And some oil and gas companies have been suing governments because of the fear of these companies that they would be losing money in the course of the shift to renewable energies. That is unacceptable, and I'm very delighted that a number of governments now have pledged to leave the Energy Charter Treaty, which is a major victory for civil society groups that have advocated for abandoning this treaty, which is exemplary in the privileges it provides to oil and gas companies and to investors in general.
Mm-hmm. I just wanted to continue because it was my organization who filed the case against Total Energies in France with Darwin Compacts Coalition, which is French organization, and also a few distinguished French lawyers, including William Bourdeau. Yes, we filed this case due to the French legislation and before the prosecutor of on war crimes and terror in France. So formally, it was not open. The case was not open because of not enough proven causal connection between Total supplies for kerosene for Russian war plans and for their military bases, but we all know that it is not true. And just before the final procedure in the prosecutor, Total withdraw from Russia completely. So they withdraw before the seeing the case. And the second example I can give you, because we have the same. So I think that there is a big potential in filing cases in suing those fossil fuel companies that have led us to such a major energy peace crisis and the crisis of also a climate crisis. And this is the future. But the next step is also confiscate their over profits and tax them in full. And also, as from Ukraine, we demand them to governments to confiscate this money and divert them to rebuild Ukraine in a clean energy, because we truly want to become a shining global energy model of the future and the first post-war countries that will be rebuilt in green. But it won't happen with all those profits being diverted to from those war crimes and war criminal companies that profited on the war in Ukraine as well. And the second case is with Wintershall Dea, the German big company, and they are quite aggressive. Total Energies were quite quiet in their public behaviors, and they just withdraw invisibly. But Wintershall also withdraw from Russia, but they were aggressive, and they are threatening activists in Germany who has helped us to have an actions, and they are threatening them with another claim and another case that they could send against them. So we will be doing. And the last comment on Energy Chapter Treaty, it's a bad treaty. We have a very good treaty, an excellent fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, but Energy Chapter Treaty is a bad treaty that must be of course not active, not being made active, but we must stop, and governments must stop. But already 10 European governments, as far as I know, have left Energy Chapter Treaty, and the process has started. And the more they do that, the more space for litigation against fossil fuel companies we have. But also, I just wanted to bring one point, that those agreements that governments are making on the supply of fossil fuels are not public, they are not transparent, and civil society cannot track them. And neither conditions, no fines. So if we also could, as fossil fuel treaty demands, open a register on fossil fuels and see those agreements that have been made for supply of fossil fuels, it could help us to get this data and to phase out fossil fuels immediately, because that is already clear for litigation and for legal means what's in there. So in those contracts, in those agreements. And also the last point is public subsidies. Another thing I wanted to tell you about Baker Hughes. It's a US-based company which supplied some parts and equipment for Russian LNG, the second huge gas project, which if Western companies will continue supply any equipments for Russian fossil fuels, for Russian fossil fuel infrastructure, we may have Russian gas export illegal, but doubled. And EU already increased for 8% LNG, liquefied natural gas. It's a fossil gas, but still LNG gas from Russia. And no one is talking about this, because gas is a epicenter of pain for the European Union. And if we will be able to cut and completely eliminate European Union gas demand, it will lead us to endorsement of fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, as I said, because the gas is the thing that European Union is addicted the most to. And Energy Chapter Treaty, the more countries exit, the better for litigation. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. And yes, it's very true that LNG is worse than pipeline gas because of the energy required to liquefy the gas and then to transport it. Do we have any questions here from the room, or anyone who's online? Feel free to post your question either in the chat or in the Q&A. Maybe I could just ask a question of Julia. Now that the IPCC has completed its sixth assessment, what is next? Will it go silent for the next few years as it starts working on the next cycle, or will we still be getting some updates?
So I'm not absolutely informed of everything that's happening at the level of the IPCC. Certainly, the IPCC is not stopping, so the process continues. And I know that some special reports are already being scoped out. I don't know what level of approval they've reached. So one of the things that will happen certainly before the next big cycle of assessment reports, which will be in 5 years or so, waiting for the literature to add up, will be special reports on specific topics. So some of those are already in the pipeline. But I don't want to say more because I'm not quite sure which ones have been approved or not.
So we still have Harjit on the line. Harjit, do you want to add anything? Would you like maybe to mention what CAN International is working on and what we can look forward to?
Sure. Thank you very much, Larry. What a pleasure to be with this panel and hearing everybody's remarks and telling very clearly the direction of travel. And let me add a couple of things. Also, in partly response to the question you asked about IPCC, there's going to be a report on cities in the next few years. So that's something that's going to be coming before the next cycle properly begins. Now, coming to what Climate Action Network is doing, and also connecting that with what needs to happen now that we have got this IPCC report. We have very clear targets in terms of emission reduction. There's such a strong message coming out on how we cannot go for further exploration and expansion of fossil fuels. Now, this is where the treaty comes up with a plan, and that's what is missing. So we know where to go, but what we have not discussed enough as a global community is how we are going to get there. And this is where, when treaty talks about 3 pillars which are connected. Number 1, no new exploration and expansion, something that we have been saying for years. Phasing out of fossil fuels in a just and equitable manner. And third, a just transition plan. And all 3 are connected with the international cooperation that is absolutely fundamental to make that transition happen. Now, when coming to Europe, it's not that the European countries didn't know the value of just transition. They had set up a just transition fund. We need something at a global level. We need European countries to take a lead. There's a lot happening, but that has to also contribute to the global action. And this is where we need to talk about equity and justice. When we talk about a global plan, we cannot just say we all are going to become carbon neutral by 2050. And that's why when UN Secretary General said that rich countries must become carbon neutral or net zero by 2040, why he says that? Because the underlying reality is that many of the fossil fuel producing countries in the global south are depending on those resources to a large part of their revenue. Talk about Timor-Leste, more than 50%. Nigeria, 40% of its oil share of government revenue comes from there. So talk about Azerbaijan and Congo, which is not the case for some of the large countries like UK, Canada, US, Norway, who are also into fossil fuel production, but their per capita income is way, way higher than these developing countries. So we need a plan, we need a framework, and that's what is missing. And that's why we need this treaty so that we can talk about fossil fuel phase out in totality. We can implement a just transition plan. And for that, we need resources, we need international cooperation. So it really bridges that gap, what IPCC tells us to do. And here treaty brings up with that solution on how we can get there. And that's important. And Climate Action Network has endorsed the treaty, and many of our nodes are engaged in the campaigning work. And we will make fossil fuel as the most important issue for us as a network as we go to COP28, hosted by a petro state. On one hand, this is such a paradox, but at the same time, it's also an opportunity to put that issue right at the center and make sure that we have an agreement. So as Climate Action Network will be working closely with the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative and many of our allies like Demand Climate Justice, Global Gas and Oil Network, Destination Zero, Power Shift Africa. We all have come together, and we are going to make a concerted effort towards this work on fossil fuel phase out, because we know that it's now the beginning of the end of fossil fuel era.
Yes, so thank you very much, Harjeet, for pointing out how fossil fuel phase out is very much the next stepping stone on our way to fighting climate change. So I think we can wrap up this press conference now, unless anyone would like to say some final remarks. But some of our panelists have had to leave, but I just want to really thank Julia and Harjeet and Svitlana here in the room with us. Thank you to journalists who have followed us online or here. And please, if you can, join us tomorrow, Thursday evening at the Schumann Roundabout here in Brussels, where we will be organizing a rally to let the 27 heads of state and government know that we are demanding this fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, and good luck and more power to you for the march tomorrow. We will join from here in solidarity.